Da, 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 da. It is FIM, simply Dynamo. Boom, boom, boom. Hey, what's up, all you crazy, wacky people? Thank you very much for joining in. It's another episode of Simply Dynamo. We're going to have a little bit more fun today because we're diving deeper into the folds. Mmm, our teeth, look at that. Just ate lunch. Yum, yum, yum. Okay, so we have ourselves some more Dynamo lessons happening today. Today we're going to be going through lists. So, as you know, there is a lot going on when it comes to programming, especially when it comes to organizing your information accordingly. And organizing your information, it requires one very large backbone, and that very large backbone is lists. Should have used my actual drum set for that. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to my demo screen. I'm going to get rid of this and show you more of what we have on the Revit application. Now, this is a live demo. I know, scary. Ooh, live. I know. But we'll get through it. I promise you, it'll be fine. I hope. We'll see. Anyway, I have this set aside. Let's dive in. Bow, bow, bow. Demo screen blank. Okay, here we go. Okay, now what you will see on this screen here is a wild and wacky list of fun things. And that is not a play on words, it is just the fact that we are going to be going through what we like to call list management. Now, on the right here, you're going to see a bunch of typical nodes that we would use in creating lists and forming them. I am not going to be using many applications that require code blocks for this. The reason why is because I want you to get to understand and know the Dynamo nodes that are available, because when you first start out, Dynamo blocks can be a little bit overwhelming, or the code blocks, because getting into the actual programming language of it might be a little bit difficult for some at first. So, baby steps. And by baby steps, I mean we're going to start with out-of-the-box solutions to provide you with the answers that you need. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go to Manage and go to Dynamo. And again, we're not touching Dynamo Player yet. Dynamo Player is the easy stuff. We're going to get into the tough stuff and get you working with this. So I would say if you really want to get into this, set yourself up a file very similar to what you see on the screen. And again, you are welcome to pause and take a look at how I've set this up. I've created some instructions, and the purpose of these instructions is to get you used to how to manipulate and work through some list management tool sets. Okay. Alrighty. So moving on. Dynamo should be open in the background. I'm just going to hit new. And you'll notice that list actually has its own list in the library. So under list, same thing as what we saw with strings in our previous class. And there's a reason that we went through strings first, is because strings kind of lead into this whole thing. So there's a couple of extra added things in here. We'll see match and organize, which they've just done this to kind of compartmentalize the language that is in here. So if we look at generate, for instance, under generate, you'll see we have our create items, we have our action items, and we have our query items. So under create, we can actually generate a list, we can generate a range, and we can generate a sequence. So a range is a set, max, and min with a variation of information in between. A sequence is a set sequence of information multiplied along a line. So does that sound familiar to our Revit users? Yes, it does. Array. Remember with the Revit array, it had a either set to last or to second. And you'll see that come into play when we start dealing with the way information is shown. We'll be getting into how we can utilize cycle, how we can utilize the joining of lists, and a whole bunch of stuff. We'll go through each of these in sequence here. So let's start off with something that we recognize already. We have our select model elements. And I'm going to use elements because we're dealing with lists now. We're not doing singular selection anymore. Okay? And what we're going to find is I'm just going to create the same number of selection here that we have across the board. So we have list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to do this the hard way first, and then we're going to slowly show you how to compartmentalize this into smaller node sets. So I'm going to go and paste a few of these like this. And this is purely for the purpose of education. I can hear you Dynamo buffs out there going, don't do it! Don't worry, do it. This is just for learning. Okay, so we have our select model elements. And, oh, I've already messed it up. Okay, select model elements, and I'm going to select these. Okay, and I'm just going to work my way down here. Just move my list over, just so you can see. And this one. Okay, so we have a bunch of crazy information here that doesn't quite make sense just yet. Well, if I hover underneath and click that button, it's showing me a list. Woohoo! That's what I'm looking for. This is exactly what I'm looking for. And as we had described in the previous two classes, you'll notice that these lists start from 0 and they work themselves up to a certain number. So they always start from 0. These are your indices, otherwise known as your index numbers. So if you're ever looking for a piece of information out of your lists, then you will try and locate these index numbers. Also in these lists, there are these things we call levels. Levels start from the inside to the very bare bones information. So for instance, number 6 here is level 1 because it's the last piece of information in the list. That means that anything that's in this first level is considered the end result. That is your level 1 piece of information. Now this list itself is one entire level. So it's actually level 2. So level 2 has 7 text notes in it at level 1. So remember these levels. These list levels are very important moving forward because it'll tell us how we can extract and grab information from a list. Okay, go away, canceled appointment. Okay, so here we go. We have a series of these. They're all unnamed currently. They could be confusing because the data in there is just saying that it's a text note. Well, we've learned a very handy dandy tool that we can utilize, and that one is get text. And of course, in typical Dynamo fashion, we have our text note.text. So same thing, I can copy and paste this stuff and move it over and do a bunch of fun things. So no, that is not what I wanted to do at all. Control C. There we go. I love live presentations. So if you're first starting out, again, this is fine. This is for the purpose of learning. So you could separate these out so you can identify what is going where and how. Okay? But in the future, we are not going to be placing all of this that you see here. The purpose of creating lists and managing lists is so that you can automate a lot of your processes. This is not automation that you're seeing here. This is a very manual workflow when it comes to programming. So we're going to break it out, start big first, and then slowly work our way in. Okay, so we have our strings, and you'll notice that I have this set to automatic. The reason being is because I'm not pushing anything back into Revit. I can keep it automatic so that I can see the updated lists happening on the fly. Okay, so let's take this first list that we have. What we've done is we've converted all of this information to strings. Okay, so we have list 1, the number. Okay, and you notice that when I click select model elements, that list 1, the number, is actually showing as a title. But the information that we want from that list is actually down here. Well, that's a little bit of a problem, isn't it? Because I don't want to actually run the actual title against any of my scripts. I just want the information below it. So how do we fix that? Well, I can do one of two things. I can remove the item from the list, or I can acquire the items below. Now, it's usually the easiest thing to do is to take the first item out of the list and take it out. So let's do that. So let's go into our list tools here. We can take a look through how we can organize them. So you can see you can like group and reorder, and you can shuffle, you can modify. So this is where you would go to drop certain items. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go to drop items. Okay. You can also use remove item at a specific index if you know the item that you want to remove. There's also add item to end or add item to front, which we'll get into. Okay, so drop items. Now, if you hover over the amount here, you'll see a little disclaimer that says amount of items to remove. If it's negative, the items will be removed from the end of the list. Okay? So if I plug string into list right now, that's my list. And right now I don't have an amount. So I am just going to type in number. And you'll see number appear. So I'm going to say 1. So when I do that, it is actually removing only one object from the very beginning of the list, therefore leaving me with all of those items. Pretty cool, right? So now I have the information that I need to move forward. So this is how we drop items as we need. If I needed to drop the 8 from the end of the list, I would just type -1, and you'll see that it will drop the 8. So for now, I'm just using the 1. So that's one way to get rid of the title. The only problem is we have this title for all of our lists right now. And we're wasting time by having to generate all of this over and over again. That can be a little bit daunting to see, at least. Okay? So you'll notice that I can create these lists 1 to 3, which I have done. I've included the titles. But now I have to remove the titles for all of those lists. So yes, by all means, you can do this if you want. But don't. There's a better way. Okay? So, again, we're going to filter this as we go through. So right now what we're going to do is do a list create. So why list create, do you ask? Well, what this allows us to do, and we're just going to deal with the first 3 bits of information here. So lists 1, 2, 3. We have the existing data, the filter, and the number. Okay. So let's disconnect that and move this over. And to disconnect, you just click on the input and then click an open space. Okay. So this list create, I can place it anywhere down the line. I could have created a list from these text note strings. But it's always best to do these list creates from the beginnings, the source material of data, as much as possible. So we hit the plus symbol as many times as we need it. In this case, I'm just going to use items 1 to 3, or 0 to 2, as you remember. And I'm going to plug in these elements. Okay, and then I can actually get rid of text note to text. So you see, right, already we have reduced the number of nodes required for our project. Because what we've done is we've generated a list, and I'll show you what that looks like here. Generated a list of these 3 lists. So now you'll see that the levels have changed. It has now added a 3rd level. There is a list that contains 3 separate lists of information at level 1. So we have the level 1, which is the information within our core lists, and those core lists are part of a master list. That master list is at level 3. So when I go to text note text, it's reaching into each of these lists and it's compiling the information that we need. So let's talk about levels. This is where things get interesting. So there's a little button here beside text note. And beside text note, you'll see a little button that says use levels. Now for the most part, Dynamo will pick up on the level it needs to change information for, and it will categorize it accordingly. Sometimes it's not the case. So currently it's giving us the text note text information for all of level 1. it's going through and doing that. But if I say use levels right now, and I tell it to go back to level 3, you'll notice that the level numbers are changing. So currently, you have to let it balance and calculate itself out. If I say to level 1, notice how it actually fuses all of these into one giant list. It's taking all of level 1 and it's compiling it all together. Again, we don't want to do that because we want to keep everything organized. So level 2 is where it decided that we need to grab the information from. So I would just leave use levels unchecked. We're going to dive into this more. If it doesn't make sense right now, that's okay. I just want to show you that the tool is here. There is a use levels button, and you can adjust where the information is being read and how. Okay? So getting rid of text, no text, getting rid of that there. We now have all of our text notes separated out into their lists. And then I can plug this string into list and tell it to drop the first one. Uh-oh. What happened? Well, this goes back to exactly what we just learned. Take note of what's happening here. Remember in our text note text here that we have 0 list, which is composed of list 1, the number. We go down a little bit. We have 1 list, which is list 2, the existing data, and the 2 list, which is list 3, the filter. But if we go over here to this drop items, you'll notice that we have list 2, the existing data, and list 3, the filter. So what happened? Well, because of the levels that are in here, this drop items is dropping the first index, which is this list, 0 list, in the previous node. This is where levels become important. It's because now I can go into list and say, instead of dropping the first list entirely, I just want to drop the first item in each list. So I go to use levels. And when I do that, you'll notice that the first word has disappeared because I'm dropping it at level 2. If I increase that to level 3 or down to level 1, you'll see that there's some things happening here that you don't want. So the idea is that you're going to use levels. You're going to reach into the level 2 levels, and you're going to remove the first item. So that's what you want to do. If you don't use levels, then it's just going to take the first index that it sees and it's going to remove it. So again, we're going to go to list, use levels, make sure it's set to level 2 because we want to edit the information within these lists. Again, this is something that you'll just pick up as we go. We're going to go over this a few times. So if you're scratching your head right now, that's perfectly normal. This is programming. There are some things that take some time to pick up on. So be patient and we will get there. All right, so we have now successfully moved titles from all 3 of those lists. Woohoo! Now what? Well, I guess we can get some item counts or something like that. So how do we do that? How do we get item counts for certain lists? Well, we can do a few things. We can run a count versus all 3 of those lists at the same time and extract the data that way. Or we can go right back to the very beginning here and get a number count from there. So let's do it both ways. So if we type in count, you'll see that we have a count button for lists. I can either plug my elements directly in there to get a full number count of the information that came through, which is fine, but again, I'm going to have to do this and this, and I'm going to have to plug it in for each of the elements that we have here. And then I'll have to separate them out, and it's kind of frustrating. We're not doing that. We're getting a little bit more automated. So we're going to take the list that we have here, and this depends on whether we want the count. So it's asking for the item count for list to the data. So we actually want the items within there. So if I plug that in, you'll see, yay, I have 3 items. No, I don't. I have 3 lists. 1, 2, 3. I want the count for the number of items within those lists. So again, use levels. There you go. So you'll see I now have a breakdown of the number of items within each list. But Dennis, why is that important? Well, that's important because these numbers have to match. They don't have to in some circumstances, but there's a reason why lists should match in certain circumstances. Because if you're trying to plug in data, it could miss or misidentify, and it could cause a confusion in how the lists talk to one another. So again, this count becomes very important. So we're just going to leave that count up there. So moving on a bit here now, it says to create a combined list. So a combined list just means that we're taking the information that we have there and we're combining it. Well, we already know how to do that. We can take that information and we can drop it down a level if you want. So if we drop it down to 1, we can create an empty list from the information. However, sometimes you're going to find this, where you get an empty list. So instead, what we can do is we can actually combine the information that you see. And we can do that by doing a few things. We can go to combine. And there's a combinator that you can use if you want to combine the 2 lists. Or we can use join, where we can take 2 separate lists and we can join them together. So what's the difference between list create and list join? Well, I'll show you in a second here. So let's go back. Let's take our 2 lists here. Our 3 lists. And let's look at the difference. So list join is actually taking them and fusing it all into one list. Same thing goes if we have the information that's coming out of there. Okay? Cool. So that's fun. I'd say that's pretty fun. We can do some pretty cool things with that. The next thing we're going to be looking at is creating a Revit elements to text or vice versa. So remember the last class we had talked about certain elements being represented as a string and certain items not being. Well, we have this list one that we called the number, but in no way or form are these actually numbers. These are all text that show a number as a character. So we have to convert those to numbers. So how do we get that information out of here to make the change? Because we don't want to do it down here before we remove the title. We don't want to be changing the title to a number because it'll just create what we call a null. So if I was to say to number, let's plug that string in there, it's going to give me this yellow error message. It's going to say, what is that? That's not a number, because it doesn't recognize it. It's not what a number would be. So there's a reason why we've taken the titles out. We're taking the raw information, which is the numbers that we saw, so that we can actually utilize something like this. Now, how do I get access to just those numbers? I don't want to, have to go through and cycle through all these lists and have to figure out, what it is and go back to the beginning. That's kind of frustrating. So I'm going to move my list count up there. I have my string to number. I'm just going to disconnect that. Okay? So I need to take this list specifically out of here so that I can edit it. Well, let's do out of the box first. So out of the box, we are going to use what we call get item at index. Okay? We're going to take that list that we have here, and then the index is referring to an integer of the item that we can fetch. So the integer being the number that you see in this list. So we want to take the information out of the 0 list. Okay? So all we would do is double click on our screen to generate a little code block here and just type 0, because that is the integer that we want to utilize for this. And presto, you will see that I only have the information that is numbers in here. I can then now take that item at index and plug it into string to number. You're like, huh, well, they kind of look the same, don't they? Well, they are not. These are actual numbers now. It has converted a string to a number. This can now be used in calculations. It can be used for formulas. It can be used for an array of things. You cannot use a string in that same context. It will create a null value. That is why when you go to actually generate string to number from an actual piece of text, like a string of text, it'll recognize that and it'll say, not happening. Okay? All right, so we have then converted that to what we need it to be. So we have another item here. We have our list 2, our existing data. We have a list here of information. The problem is we need it to continue on a certain pattern. And we don't have that pattern right now, which is kind of frustrating, isn't it? So we can create some rules, we can create some regulations, we can add in prefixes or suffixes, we can do all kinds of fun things to this list. So let's have a look at this. So if we want to say, for instance, take certain items or match up certain items, we can do that. But let's do this one by one. Okay, so we have our get item at index, we have our string to number, and we have 3 separate lists going on. We have our 7 and our 8, but in that list number 2 here, we're missing 7th item and 8th item. Well, that's no good. Let's see if we can add those. Okay, so we have a count value. We have 8 values in one, we have 6 in the other. How do we add those 2 extra items to the end of the list? Well, we can either create a sublist with the information that we have provided, or we can manually input the data using a code block. Let's try a few options here. So we do a code block. I can type in 8th item, let's say. Let's try and keep it all caps the same way. Something like that. And then the same thing, I can create another one down below. Let's make it super confusing. Let's say 7th item. Make it upside down. Okay? Again, see, it catches me if I don't put my quotation marks in there. Very manual process. I have 2 separate items here. Kind of confusing, right? Not really making sense. I'm even going to make it even more confusing and turn this into its own list. Just because I'm evil. All right, let's get rid of that. Let's remove all those nodes. And I can do myself a solid and switch these up and put the order so that it shows 7th item and 8th item. Well, I have myself a little sublist here. I can now switch my index here to 1 and you'll see the values change. But I'm more interested in changing the text that you see at the bottom of your screen. So here we have a list. We have another created list down here. And remember that awesome little node we learned about back then, where we can join and generate a list from 2 separate items? Well, let's do just that. Cool! Look what it's done! It's created a list for me. Pretty cool. Yeah, I can generate this new list, and then I can use it moving forward. And then depending on how I want to set up that code block, I can do that. You can automate these things so that they're a little bit easier for you. So if you wanted to maximize and make sure that you have 8 items in each of your lists, it will take any of the null values that you have here and convert it into an actual word. And then you can replace those words with certain numbers. So there's lots of ways you can go about this. I don't want to over confuse everyone, but I just wanted to say that you can combine these lists to balance them out. There are also ways that you can, later on down the line, we're going to talk about when we get to list 5, is how to cycle data so that we can generate a preset list and cycle it. Okay, so what we have done is, moving down the line here, is we've taken a series of lists. We've told it to drop the titles from each of those lists. We have then said to get one of those lists to use for our purposes. In this case, it was the second list. And then we've told it to add some items to the end of it. That's pretty cool, right? All right, so we now know how to join a list together from existing information. This is very, very important to learn. So like, let's say for instance, we have another code block for whatever reason, okay? And we want to add a prefix to all of the items in this list. So let's just call this words. Okay. Well, remember before where we showed you how to concat? Well, this is where you do that. I can take this word with this list of words, and you'll see here that it is added words to the front of each of those items. And you'll notice that it's actually just done this as a separated list, okay? So if I take a look at use levels, watch what I can play around with here. If I change my levels up at the top, not really doing much for me, is it? So if I change my levels down here at the bottom, why did I add a list? There we go. And change the way that I'm representing this information. I want to add words, string, concat to each of these. Yep. Of course, it's not adding 3. Yeah, it should be fine. It should be fine. Oh no, not happening. All right, what you doing to me? Let's join. Well, fine then. 4th item. String concat. Maybe it's just the way that my information is showing. Okay, so it is separating out these lists for whatever wild reason. It's supposed to be adding them to the front of each of them. Okay. Probably because the lists aren't the exact same. So we were going to do cycle at the end, but we're going to do it now. Okay, so remember before we learned how to do list count? I love doing live presentations. Well, we can take a list. We have the number of objects that are in there. I can take the word that I have here, and I can add the amount and cycle it. So what does cycle do is it just takes it and multiplies that item or that list item that many times. So you'll see that I now have a list of words. Pretty cool, right? And that number matches the number of the list that we see over there. Why isn't this working? This is so wild. Okay. Anyway, maybe that's not the way it works. Why do I feel like I'm getting strung along? Probably using the wrong one. You watch. String join. String. Yeah, same thing. Okay. So concating, I don't know why this isn't working. It's usually worked for me in the past. So, okay. Well, add. So you can add item to front or add to the string. So right where you've got in a string, modify, you can go to insert at index. So if you have that words dash, take your string, take your index, 0, and to insert, let's get rid of this, is the word words. So another way, just to add it in. I guess you can't concatenate if it's in list. That's a one-off. Fun. Fun, fun, fun. Hopefully that's something that is more fixed later on. So inserting a string into the actual string itself and being able to generate it that way. Now, for some reason, I'm pretty sure you're supposed to be able to concat on a full list. But anyway, so if you really want to, you can add a prefix to all of them by using insert at a specific index. So string insert at 0 because I want to add it at the beginning of that text. And then I'm adding in this word for every item that you see there. So for those of you that are creating sheet naming opportunities, we can go down and create, let's say, mech to identify that it is a mechanical type drawing. You can see it does it for all of them, or whatever that may be. If I want to publish that information back into Revit, say for instance the set text for certain items, I can do that, but we're not going to do that here. Okay. Okay, so inserting a string. Moving on here. So we then have 3 sets of lists. We have one that's called the filter. So let's do some deleting here and go back a few steps and delete everything. Okay, from our list create, same thing. We are going to generate a value that comes out of it. So in this case, we have 3 lists of text notes. We need to convert those to, or get text. Okay, those are now text notes. We are then going to take out an item at index or a specific list. Okay, in this case, we are going to identify list 3. So we need to get item at index 2. Because if you remember on that list, the 3rd list is actually number 2. Okay. Now, from that list, we can cut out the titles if we want. We can go through and just remove that first item. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to drop item. And I am just going to do 1 so that my list is only composed of the data that's in there. And what you're going to see is a list of values. In this list of values, we're seeing a series of yeses and nos. But I only want to edit the items that say yes. So when we have a list, this is what we call using Boolean masks. So we can filter a list by using a rule set. So we're going to type in filter, and we learned this briefly in the last class. So filter by Boolean mask. So what does this mean? This means that I am going to use a rule to find the items that I want out of a list to make it easier now. So filter by Boolean mask. We are going to use the rule contains or equals. So in this case, I'm going to use equals. And you'll notice that this is an operator. This is a math operator. I can also use contains, which is contains string. So we have some options available to us. No matter which route I use, I'm going to type in the word yes here. Okay? I'm going to plug this into both of these. So into my y value, search for yes. So either option. So if I take this list and plug it into here, it's going to go through and identify whether or not the object is equaling yes. So if I look at my drop-down items, I have yes, 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 yes. But it's labeling that as false. Why? Because it's not a number. It's not an operator. Okay? So I take this item, look for string, search for, I'm going to see now it is labeling the one as false because, well, it says no. But what do we do with this information? Now that we have a list of trues and falses, the trues are the ones that meet the condition that I've sought out, and the falses are the ones that do not meet that condition. So I can now take that Boolean, filter by the Boolean, and mask it out so that I can use it in the future. So I have my list that's filtered by a specific rule set, but I need the list that I'm going to be pulling forward. So this is very important. It is the list that you are going to be filtering, not the list that you used to perform the filtering. So, for instance, I may want to edit just the text. So I'm going to take this list of text and plug it in. If I hit this drop down right now, you're going to see in the in area, all my yeses are organized. In the no area is the ones that I do not want currently. The benefit to using a filter by Boolean mask is we now have two variables. We have the ones that don't meet and the ones that do. And we can create different variations of where this information goes down the line. So if we wanted to use the no values to perform this action, we can move them down below. If we want to use the yes values to create a certain action, we can go up to a vertical up here. That's pretty cool, right? So then now we can do whatever we want with this. I can say, let's see, what do we have? String, we can do some variations here. So there's a bunch of different things that we can do. We can replace. So if I want to replace with a old Kool-Aid reference, oh yeah. Okay. We can replace with, we'll take that word yes that we had down at the beginning here, search for, replace it with oh yeah. And there we go. We've got ourselves a new naming convention. Problem with this is that the information that I have brought out cannot be transferred back to Revit easily. Why is that the case? Well, because I now have 5 items in this list. So if I push this back to those same items that I had before, it's only going to switch these first 5 items to what I want them to be. And that's a problem. I actually want it to read out the items that say yes. So how do I fix that? How do I change the way that this information is being represented? Well, as you may have noticed down the line here, we had actual elements, these text note elements, that were brought down the line. We told it to get certain items at index. Well, that was all good and fancy. The problem is we weren't dragging the actual elements down the line as we went. So when we go back down here, we have no way of representing it properly. So what we need to do is swap our text note text with our get item at index. And you'll see here that we have a new breakdown of the information provided. So then we can take this a little bit further. We can say drop items. Okay, do we want to drop that item at the list? Yeah, sure do. Going further down. We then have our text notes, which is now broken down into this yes, yes, no, no value, but only for the elements that we see here. But there's a difference. So watch as we go through here. I'm taking this and converting it to text notes and doing what I did before. It's still giving me the same true and false that we had originally. But I'm using the elements list now. So the actual text note elements are being filtered. So you'll see that now my text notes are being shown. So these 5 elements I can now change the values for. So instead of before, I just had raw text which had no connection to Revit whatsoever. can now be plugged into my string replace. So how do I go about doing that? Well, we have to actually take the values that we have, and we see these values here. They're yes, 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 or oh yeah, or whatever it is. We have the information broken down into a filtered Boolean mask. So then I can now take, and instead of string replace, I can actually just plug this information into Revit. So I can take a string. I can go to set text. The text notes are all right here. And then I just plug the value. And you'll see that all of those items that we labeled as yes are now changed. But this is the best part. What happens if I want to do the other side and say, oh no, copy this, and then plug oh no into that. Well, wrong text note. I want the out version. And I'm just going to re-put that in. So you'll see here that I can now have two different verticals. I can use my in values and my out values to generate new content. And then depending what I want to do, because I'm working automatically, I'm changing values on the fly. Awesome. Awesome. All right. I'm assuming I'm still showing my screen, which is good. Okay, so we can set notes, we can set text, we can do all kinds of fancy things like that. So we've now gone through the condition where we can swap out strings, we can take data and do that. We can add new lists to the end of the information that we have. We can definitely get into certain things like adding data into a list category. So for instance, like data replacement, the ones that we just did, all we would have to do is select the list out of here and replace it with new information. Now, this is just the beginning part of working with lists. We can also integrate our lists with Excel, and we can generate the content accordingly for that. But the way the information is being portrayed has to be done in a certain way. So if we have all this listed information here, and I'll give you a breakdown of how that looks. So we have all these text notes broken down. If I go to my text note, no, I don't want set text. I want this one. If I took all the information that I have here, okay, the way that this is listed out is no good when you go to take it into a database software. When you look at something like Excel, the way that data is plugged into Excel is it goes from left to right. So the data will insert going in this direction. And then once it runs out of information, it's going to go down to the next row. And it's going to input information again this way. So you have to be very cautious about how you bring that data in. The way that Dynamo works is that it goes in columns. So it takes the data and it plugs it down this way. So how do we prepare ourselves for that inevitability? Well, there's this fun thing with lists called Transpose. And it's a two-way script. It would work in two different directions. So if I transpose this data, watch what happens. So instead of it compiling itself into three lists, it has now separated it into the number of objects that match up at each integer. So we know that there's an item at 0 for each of these lists. But when we get down to 7, you'll notice that there's 2 null values. There's just nothing there. There's nothing to show. But the way that it's representing the information is it's going horizontally. So if you see list 1, list 2, list 3, guess what? That's all the titles. Awesome. That's exactly what I wanted to do. So if I was to bring that into Excel, it would put list 1, list 2, list 3. And then it would go into the next one and start again and put in the data that corresponds with those titles. So that's how we separate out our lists to get them prepared for Excel. So think of it as grouping your lists or transposing them for Excel integration. So the way that this transpose works is it's two ways, like I had mentioned. So if I get a list that comes in from an Excel file, I can take it and plug it into here, and it'll go back into the format that Revit wants to see. So that's very key. So you cannot input data into Revit without it being all grouped together in one facet. So if it came in like this, you'd be sending information all over the place. So in our next class is going to be all about Excel integration and how we can utilize Excel to springboard your Revit workflows. We're going to get into how we can use transposed lists to drive information inside of your Revit environment. Now, I think I've beaten strings to a pulp. We can replace using lists. We can generate all different types of combinations using lists. They're like, again, if you want to go through the items that we see here, we've gone through cycle, we've gone to how to add items, we've gone how to filter by Boolean masks. The one thing we didn't touch on is flattening lists. So if I have information here that I just want to put all into one giant list, well, I can do that by flattening. So I would literally just plug it in, and then you'll see it'll flatten it all down. If I was like 6 or 7 levels deep, I'd have to tell it how many times I want to flatten. If you're doing -1, it's just going to go. But if you're doing like 2 or 3 or whatever, it'll only go down a certain amount of lists. Okay. Alrighty. So what I would suggest is start generating some lists, start chopping them, start showing how you can take them apart, gathering information out of it. For now, master the filter by Boolean mask. And by doing that, you can change this out. It doesn't have to be string contains, but strings are probably the #1 easiest way to filter most of your lists in Revit. So I would suggest utilizing string contains or some version of string to help you filter out your lists. If you need to transfer or generate them into strings, you can do that too. You'll find that to be more user-friendly. If you're using numbers, you're more than welcome to use an operator. So if you want to use the equal button, for instance, if I go back to my text notes, let's go back to the original list. One here, the text notes were showing as, sorry, not 1, 0. So we have our text note texts. We had them to number. And then I want to see if there's anyone that equals 4. And you'll see that one of those does in fact equal the number 4. So if I was converted those to actual numbers and used my equals node, it will say that the third item in that list, 0, 1, 2, 3, is the number 4. If I look down here, yep, 0, 1, 2, 3 is true. That it does actually equal 4. It doesn't eat 4. So anyway, take some time to identify and create your own variations of this. You can use it to add prefixes. And if you want to add a second layer of information to that, hey, look at me, I added oh no's to the end of it. You can try this out with actual parameters inside your project. Like for instance, I have a list of elements that are in my project. So let's see here. I have all these text notes. And there's something common about all these text notes. They all have some parameters, they have some capabilities. So I have all these objects that I can select here. There's type values that are in them, fun things that I can do. So we can create the list from all the text notes that we have available. And then I can convert that to text note. And then I can go to set text, just because I'm mean. And I'm scared to do this. String text note. String text note. What am I doing here? Text note string. Yes. No, I'm plugging in the text note. And then I can plug in a specific value. Otherwise, I can actually change the parameters that belong to them. So if I was to say get parameter for text note, let's just say, what one do we want? There's so many options. So we can use, do they need arc leaders? I don't know, let's try it. So set parameter by name. Okay, we have our text note elements, which are here. Now I'm going to set this to manual because I don't want it running on its own. Now our parameter name, which is called arc leaders. Okay, it's on the right hand side. Now, if you get confused about what the type of parameter arc leaders is, remember that you can always go to element.parameters. Okay, plug that into the list. I'm just going to freeze this for now and then hit run. And if you take a look below, it tells you the type of parameters and how that Revit wants to see the answers. So for instance, it's saying no. Well, I think that's pretty easy to understand, that we now want it to say, oops, yes, for each of those. Value, yes, run. Okay, so then in there, parameter storage type is not a string. Why? Is it a true? There you go. So yes or no, which is a Boolean, also means true or false, or on or off. So we would just set that to true. Okay, and you'll see that the check mark has in fact set itself for all of these text to have arc leaders. Okay. Okay, anyway, that's enough for now. We will dive more into lists next week when we do Excel management. So we're going to learn how to take information from Excel, drive it into our Revit, and how to really get into the gritty of organizing and setting out our lists. All right, there were a few hiccups today. I love doing live demonstrations purely for that application. You're going to find that working with Dynamo, you're going to forget things easily, because I do. I do have my own scripts that are very organized in terms of how they show lists. And this is a good reminder for me of how to find and hunt for things as I work through a problem. So don't be shocked if you're fighting through this just like I am at any given day. Take some time to search for things. You may not be familiar with all the nodes that are available, but you will. But just know that working with lists does take some patience. Next week, we'll get into the really, really heavy stuff that comes with list management and how to filter them and map them properly. Anyway, thank you very much for joining in. I hope this was informative, and I look forward to doing some more with you next week. Thank you.